The first warning didn't come with smoke or noise. It came from a small needle sliding left on a dashboard stamped in another language. A captured German SD KFZ-7, tall, confident, freshly topped off, was barely 10 miles out when its fuel gauge began dropping as if the road itself were drinking from the tank. The GI at the wheel, used to the familiar habits of an M3 half-track, tapped the glass once, the way drivers do when they hope a gauge is playing tricks. It wasn't. The Maybach under the long hood sounded smooth, the tracks bit into the damp road with reassuring grip, the towed gun followed neatly, everything felt right, except for the pace at which the machine wanted more gasoline. It was spring 1945, the season when forward motion mattered more than elegance. American formations were pushing through towns and farm country toward river lines and rail junctions, guided as much by logistics officers as by map pins. Every barrel of fuel represented a journey, across the ocean, through ports, along roads guarded from weather and worry. In that world, range was not an interesting statistic. It was the difference between a column that arrived at dusk and a column that slept on the roadside. The SD KFZ-7 arrived with a reputation forged over years of watching it from across the lines. Crews had seen it tow heavy guns in mud that made ordinary trucks stall, had watched it shoulder awkward slopes with calm strength, had learned to associate its silhouette with a certain kind of problem-solving power. It looked and felt like a specialist. Wide tracks, overlapping road wheels, a stance that said, "Give me weight and bad ground." The first mile confirmed the legend. The second made the crew grin. The third introduced the quiet question, could they afford to love a machine that asked this much from the fuel truck? Across the column, the M3 half-tracks told a different story. They were the dependable ones, commercial routes, shared parts, a known appetite, and a habit of finishing their loop with fuel to spare for contingencies. No one wrote songs about their fuel economy, but every motor sergeant could plan a week around it. Put an American crew into a seized German tractor, and they would naturally start comparing. How far on a tank? How often do we stop? What happens when we add a hill, a detour, a stretch of soft shoulder? At first, the German machine dazzled. It made rough ground feel manageable. The steering demanded muscle but answered faithfully. The tow hook held the big gun as if it were an ordinary trailer, and the engine's response stayed steady instead of peaky. From the driver's seat, it felt like a locomotive scaled for roads, patient, powerful, unbothered by obstacles that usually sent 3 men with shovels to the shoulder. Everyone could see why this tractor had earned its place. Then the practicalities arrived with clipboards and pencils. A quartermaster lieutenant, more curious than critical, proposed something simple. Measure, don't guess. Top off one M3 and one SD. KFZ-7. Give them comparable loads. Send them over the same mixed loop, paved miles out, cross-country section, paved miles home. Record the refill precisely. No theory needed, just numbers. They rolled at dawn under a sky that promised scattered showers. The convoy leader kept time by ear, the harmonies of engines under load, the tempo of gear changes, and by the neat ticks of a wristwatch. The outbound leg went smoothly. The cross-country segment confirmed what everyone suspected. The German tractor owned bad ground, the American half-track endured it. On the turn back, the SD KFZ-7 driver radioed a casual update with a careful tone. We'll need fuel earlier than planned. The fuel truck shifted its route without drama. The column closed ranks, then stretched out again when the road allowed. Back in the yard, they pulled caps and let the numbers speak. The M3 took a measured gulp and still had headspace. The SD KFZ-7 drank deep, so deep the refuel ledger looked like it belonged to a longer journey. Nobody shouted. Nobody lectured. The lieutenant drew 2 short columns on a piece of cardboard. Miles, gallons. He ran his finger down the page, then looked up at the drivers. Same work, different cost, he said, not unkindly. That little table of figures made the road map grow. If one tractor needed that much more fuel to finish a day's loop, what did a battery of them do to a week's plan? How many tanker trips did that imply? How many road miles of exposure for fuel trucks? How many bridges occupied? How many extra minutes at vulnerable stop points? Scale is where small differences become large facts. The SD KFZ-7 could do things an M3 would rather avoid. But across the common mile, the ordinary, necessary mile repeated 10,000 times. The American standard extracted less from the entire formation. No one in that yard mistook clarity for contempt. The crews respected the German machine for exactly what it was, a heavy-duty tool built for traction and pull. They also respected the arithmetic that governs movement. A specialist can be brilliant. A system must be sustainable. As the column prepped for the next tasking, the convoy commander penciled a note beside tomorrow's route. Assign captured tractors to short, difficult legs. Keep long legs with M3S stage fuel accordingly. It wasn't a verdict so much as a promise to the mission. Use the right muscle in the right moment and protect the tempo that wins weeks. As the next day began, the air smelled faintly of oil and rain. Supply crews moved between vehicles, checking caps, tightening straps, marking route boards with chalk. The captured SD KFZ-7 sat among the olive-drab half-tracks like visiting athletes, bigger, cleaner, slightly foreign in posture. GIs drifted over during breakfast, coffee mugs in hand, curious to see these machines that looked like tanks that forgot their turrets. Someone joked that the Germans must have built them to pull the entire war behind them. No one disagreed. When the convoy rolled out again, the contrast between the vehicles grew more obvious. The M3S moved briskly, almost lightly, their engines humming in a predictable rhythm. The German tractors followed with slow authority, the ground vibrating slightly as their overlapping wheels churned over ruts. The crews couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship, tight tolerances, smooth gear shifts, and an unmistakable feeling of strength in reserve. Yet every driver noticed something else too. The fuel gauge moved faster than the road under the tracks. By mid-morning, the first refueling truck was already dispatched. What should have been a full day's journey now required a stop barely past noon. It wasn't catastrophic. Logistics always allowed for flexibility, but it forced a reckoning. When every gallon had to be shipped across the ocean, driven inland, and guarded at every mile, extra fuel wasn't a casual detail. The convoy leader, watching from the lead jeep, began to realize the captured vehicles, while impressive, carried a hidden cost that multiplied invisibly with each movement. That afternoon, as the units regrouped near Bridgehead, the officers compared notes. The reports were straightforward: excellent traction, strong towing performance, comfortable ride on poor roads, but fuel use far beyond expectation. The younger soldiers found the situation amusing. "She's strong, but she drinks like a sailor," one said. The senior NCOs didn't laugh. They had seen too many operations delayed because a truck or tank didn't have enough range to reach the next supply point. Over the next several days, engineers conducted controlled comparisons, noting everything from fuel weight to maintenance time. They learned that the SD KFZ-7's Maybach engine, beautifully designed, smooth, and responsive, was tuned for power rather than efficiency. It ran rich, feeding more gasoline than necessary to ensure consistent torque under load. In peacetime, that might have been a luxury. In wartime Europe, it was a liability. The findings rippled through the supply chain. Reports went upward, phrased politely but clearly. Captured German heavy tractors demonstrate high capability, low endurance. It was a tidy sentence for a complicated truth. The German approach favored short bursts of strength. The American system favored endurance. Both philosophies made sense in their own worlds, but on this side of the front, with bridges to cross and long hauls between depots, endurance was the only thing that mattered. As the days passed, crews began developing their own informal rules for using the German machines. They reserved them for the hardest jobs, towing heavy guns through mud, clearing bog supply trucks, or hauling broken armor from difficult ground. For these short, punishing tasks, the SD KFZ-7 shined. It did what few vehicles could do without complaint. But no one volunteered to take it on long road runs anymore. Even the drivers, once thrilled by the challenge of mastering a foreign machine, quietly preferred their M3S reliability and range. They realized were not glamorous virtues until you didn't have them. Every night, as the mechanics serviced the vehicles under dim lamps, the contrast between the two designs became clearer. The M3's engine compartment opened easily, its components simple and familiar. The SD KFZ-7's internals, though elegantly arranged, demanded careful attention. Filters and fittings were positioned for precision, not convenience. The mechanics respected it. It was a marvel of engineering, but they also knew which one they could rebuild faster under pressure. Out on the roads, where the mud swallowed time and the horizon shifted with every mile, the lesson was writing itself without anyone needing to spell it out. The Germans had built machines to win battles. The Americans had built machines to win campaigns. And sometimes, the difference was written in gallons rather than gunfire. By the third week of trials, the experiment had turned into a quiet routine. Each morning, the motor pool lined up the two types of vehicles side by side, the American M3S on one end, the German SD KFZ-7s on the other. Drivers would check fluid levels, crank the engines, and listen to the familiar cough and growl that signaled another long day on the road. They no longer needed to talk about the differences. Everyone could see them unfold mile by mile. The American half-tracks behaved like well-trained horses, steady, obedient, content to move at a consistent pace. The SD KFZ7s, in contrast, were like draft animals built for extremes. They were magnificent in short bursts, unstoppable in soft terrain or steep gradients, but the longer they ran, the more their appetite showed. Even the drivers joked about it now, calling their machines gas collectors or fuel magnets. Humor, as always, made the truth easier to carry. The logistical reports, however, stripped the humor away. Fuel officers began calculating the broader impact of keeping the captured tractors in service. A typical M3 half-track consumed roughly half the fuel of its German counterpart for the same towing duty. At small scale, that was manageable. But when planners multiplied that across a full artillery regiment, dozens of guns, trucks, and support vehicles, the difference was staggering. Each extra refueling meant not just gasoline, but manpower, risk, and time. Every tank or truck sent forward was another asset that needed guarding, another chance for delay. Commanders quickly understood that the issue wasn't mechanical failure, it was design philosophy. The SD KFZ-7 had been built for a type of warfare that assumed fuel depots close to the front, where operations moved in sharp, decisive bursts. But by 1945, the war had become a marathon. Long supply lines, unpredictable terrain, and constant movement rewarded machines that could travel farther on less. The German tractor was brilliant within its narrow field of excellence, but outside that field, it became a liability. Meanwhile, the M3 proved why it had earned the reputation of the Army's workhorse. It wasn't as glamorous, nor as strong, but it was efficient, fixable, and, most importantly, predictable. It didn't need special treatment or frequent refueling. It simply kept going. In war, predictability is its own kind of armor. Still, no one doubted the quality of the German engineering. Mechanics were impressed by how the SD KFZ-7's components fit together. The engine's hum, the precision of the transmission, the smooth engagement of gears, it was craftsmanship of a rare kind. They built it like a watch, one GI remarked, peering under the hood. But we need a clock that runs all year without winding. That comment summed up the mood in the camp, admiration mixed with practicality. When another comparison test was run, the results mirrored the first, twice the fuel for similar performance. The officers didn't even need to crunch the numbers anymore. Instead, they used the tractors selectively, pairing them with missions that needed power more than range. The SD KFZ-7s were sent to move heavy artillery up short slopes or pull bogged vehicles from ditches. They became, in effect, the Army's emergency muscle. Everyone knew that using them too long or too far meant feeding an appetite that the supply lines could barely support. The irony wasn't lost on the crews. They were using one of the enemy's most advanced vehicles as a specialist tool rather than a frontline workhorse. It was a reversal of expectations, a reminder that performance on paper didn't always translate to practicality on the ground. The Americans respected the German machines but trusted their own more. Reliability, they learned, was a kind of quiet genius. At night, as the convoy rested and the sky turned dark over fields of half-buried tracks, the men sat on crates and traded stories. One driver said he felt the German tractor was like driving a tank that wants applause. Another replied, "I'll take one that just wants gas every other day." The laughter rolled through the camp, light but knowing. It wasn't arrogance, it was experience speaking. By the time the next morning came, the motor sergeant had added a new rule to the board: captured vehicles, short hauls only. Beneath it, someone had scribbled in chalk, "and bring your own tanker." As April unfolded, the war moved faster than the paperwork that tried to track it. Every bridge repaired, every road cleared, and every convoy that reached its destination pushed the front line deeper into Germany. The SD KFZ-7s, now folded into a few American units, became familiar sights on the edges of these advances. Their broad tracks and heavy silhouettes stood out among the rows of olive-green half-tracks and jeeps. Wherever the ground turned ugly, muddy slopes, bomb-cratered roads, collapsed bridges, the German tractors earned their keep. When the ground was too soft for trucks, the SD KFZ-7s took over, dragging supply wagons or artillery that no wheeled vehicle dared approach. The crews admired the machine's strength in those moments. "If we need something moved," one lieutenant said, "give me the German one." But he quickly added, Just don't ask it to go far. That single sentence could have been its epitaph. Fuel convoys had become lifelines stretching across Europe. The farther east the Allies pushed, the more strained those lines became. Drivers joked that gasoline had more frequent flyer miles than they did. It had sailed the Atlantic, rolled across France, and crossed rivers just to end up in a vehicle that would burn through it in hours. Every unnecessary trip meant risk. Each barrel wasted meant something else, perhaps rations delayed, or ammunition waiting at a depot for trucks that never arrived. Within the logistical corps, officers began using the SD KFZ-7 as a case study. They treated it not just as a vehicle, but as a lesson. Technical teams recorded its consumption rate, maintenance needs, and mechanical quirks. The data told a story beyond machinery. It told of priorities. German engineers had designed for power and precision, assuming that fuel would follow. American engineers had designed for longevity, assuming that it might not. Both mindsets produced excellence, but only one could endure the grinding pace of a global war. In a sense, the German half-track became a symbol of the war's shifting nature. Early in the conflict, when victories were swift and resources seemed abundant, power had been king. But now, at the war's end, endurance had dethroned it. Armies didn't win because their engines roared louder, but because their supply trucks arrived on time. A gallon saved was a mile gained, and in 1945, miles mattered more than glamour. The contrast between the two nations' designs fascinated American analysts. When they disassembled the SD KFZ-7's engine, they saw perfection in miniature, finely machined pistons, polished fittings, precisely balanced components. It was almost overbuilt, stronger than it needed to be, yet consuming more than it should. The M3, by comparison, looked simpler, almost crude. But it was a simplicity born of purpose. It could be built faster, repaired anywhere, and fueled by the same gasoline that powered 100 other vehicles in the Army's lineup. As one report quietly noted, German craftsmanship is remarkable, but craftsmanship does not supply convoys. The sentence circulated among logistics officers as a kind of proverb. It was the invisible truth behind every advance. No matter how fine the tool, it was the supply line that decided whether it could be used again tomorrow. Meanwhile, on the ground, the men who drove the SD KFZ-7s learned to read its moods. It pulled confidently on inclines but punished careless throttle control. It could climb out of deep ruts but made drivers nervous on long flat roads, because every smooth mile was another dent in the fuel reserves. Mechanics learned to keep an extra can at hand, not out of regulation but instinct. The Maybach engine, they joked, had a second stomach. By month's end, the tractors had become something between a curiosity and a cautionary tale. They weren't abandoned, they were too useful for that, but they were handled carefully, like museum pieces pressed back into service. When fuel convoys were tight, they were parked. When the roads turned ugly, they were unleashed. And when American officers briefed new arrivals about captured equipment, they always ended with the same line: if you take a German half-track, take a fuel truck with it. The remark usually got a laugh, but the truth behind it wasn't funny at all. It was the quiet arithmetic of a war that ran on gasoline. By mid-April, word about the gas-guzzling German tractors had spread beyond the individual units that used them. Reports from multiple divisions described the same pattern: superb mechanical performance, catastrophic efficiency. What began as local anecdotes evolved into official documentation. Ordnance officers, engineers, and logistics planners collected the data, not out of curiosity, but because it revealed something critical about the enemy's collapse. When the first standardized tests were organized, the process was almost scientific. One M3 half-track and one SD KFZ-7 were filled with the same grade of gasoline, their tanks carefully measured. Both were assigned identical routes, miles of paved road, stretches of rough terrain, and back again. They were hitched to equivalent loads, artillery pieces weighing nearly the same. The goal was to see, under the same conditions, how far each could go before the needle hit empty. The results confirmed what soldiers already knew instinctively. The M3 completed its course with fuel to spare. The SD KFZ-7 didn't. It drained its tank long before the finish line, demanding a refill just to make it back. The numbers were undeniable. On average, the German vehicle consumed nearly twice as much fuel for the same distance. The difference wasn't about driver skill, weather, or luck. It was baked into the design itself. When these findings reached the upper levels of command, they triggered a quiet but profound discussion. Fuel was more than a logistical matter, it was strategic oxygen. Every drop that powered a tank or truck represented a chain of ships, pipelines, and lives. And now, the Americans saw clearly that the German army had been bleeding that oxygen long before its defeat became visible. Officers who had once admired German engineering began to view it differently. "They built too beautifully," one colonel remarked during a debriefing. "It's art that can't march." That phrase would later appear in multiple field reports as shorthand for what analysts were discovering. The Wehrmacht's vehicles were marvels, but they were also impractical for a sustained global conflict. The SD KFZ-7's case was especially revealing. On paper, it had everything: power, traction, durability. But in the field, it demanded a constant stream of fuel trucks just to keep up. For an army already struggling to supply its front lines, that demand was ruinous. Each refueling stop slowed progress, exposed supply convoys to attack, and forced planners to divert resources from more critical needs. Efficiency, once dismissed as a peacetime virtue, now proved to be the ultimate wartime weapon. Among the enlisted men, the lessons were more personal. Drivers compared notes the way soldiers trade stories about weather or rations. Some took pride in coaxing a few extra miles out of their assigned vehicles, experimenting with throttle discipline or reduced loads. Others treated the SD KFZ-7s as temporary companions, impressive, unpredictable, and never fully trusted. "You could almost feel it asking for more gas," one GI wrote in a letter home. "Like it was alive, but hungry." That strange mix of respect and frustration defined the American experience with captured German machinery. The SD KFZ-7 was a reminder that technology alone didn't decide wars. Sustainability did. It was easy to admire a machine that could tow an 88mm gun through mud. It was harder to admire one that needed a refuel every few hours to do it. In the evenings, as officers gathered over maps and ration charts, someone always mentioned the German vehicles. The conversations followed a familiar rhythm: first admiration, then disbelief, and finally realization. "They built for perfection," a logistics captain said, tracing a line across a fuel route, "and we built for persistence. I know which one wins a long race." By then, the SD KFZ-7s were fewer on the roads. Some had broken down, others were parked deliberately to conserve fuel. But they lingered in memory, a loud, powerful symbol of a grand design that forgot the simplest truth of war: a machine is only as strong as the supply line that feeds it. By late April, the front lines had advanced so quickly that even the most seasoned logisticians struggled to keep up. Bridges were patched with planks, fuel drums were stacked in courtyards, and every depot buzzed with organized chaos. Somewhere within that chaos, a few SD KFZ-7s still rumbled along, their deep Maybach growl echoing between shattered buildings and forest roads. They were rare now, half relic, half tool, but they kept appearing in reports, usually accompanied by the same observation: excellent performance, impossible appetite. In one convoy, an artillery unit tried to use 3 captured German tractors to haul 15cm howitzers toward the next firing position. The terrain was brutal: mud, shallow craters, and the remains of torn-up roads. The SD KFZ-7s excelled. They clawed through where every American truck had bogged down, dragging their guns behind them like stubborn beasts. The soldiers who watched were impressed. The tractors looked unstoppable. But by the time they reached the destination, each had burned through nearly its entire tank. Without immediate refueling, they couldn't return to base. Their triumph lasted less than a day. Moments like that became teaching points for the logistics corps. Commanders began instructing younger officers on what they called the German paradox. The enemy's machines were often masterpieces, but masterpieces with blind spots. The engineers who built them had valued peak performance so much that they had overlooked endurance. It was a small detail on paper, yet one that echoed across the entire war. When the fuel stopped, so did everything else. The contrast between the German and American philosophies became more striking the closer analysts looked. The M3's White 160AX engine had been designed for commercial trucks before the war, a civilian heart adapted for military needs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient, easy to maintain, and forgiving of rough treatment. The SD KFZ-7's Maybach, by contrast, was designed for power. It demanded careful tuning and drank fuel freely to maintain that strength. Both engines worked as intended. They just served 2 very different assumptions about what a war would look like. To the men on the ground, those assumptions had faces and consequences. A fuel truck stuck in the mud could halt an entire operation. A convoy that needed to refuel twice as often had twice as many chances to be delayed or lost. When supplies lagged behind, artillery went silent, tanks stood still, and divisions waited for fuel that might never arrive. Every extra gallon burned by an SD KFZ-7 was a small but measurable weight pulling against the momentum of the entire army. The irony was that the Americans had never designed their vehicles to be elegant. Function came first, efficiency second, appearance last. And yet, that very lack of refinement turned out to be their greatest strength. Their machines were built for a long, uncertain war, not a short, decisive one. They didn't assume the next fuel depot would be nearby. They assumed it might not exist at all. That cautious design philosophy, what some soldiers called practical pessimism, kept engines running when nothing else did. As the front pressed eastward, the SD KFZ-7s gradually disappeared from active service. Some broke down and were stripped for spare parts. Others were parked permanently to save gasoline. But their legacy lingered in conversation and in notebooks. Officers jotted observations like exceptional build, unfit for sustained use, or a marvel of engineering, defeated by arithmetic. The language was dry, but the meaning was profound. Behind every glowing description of German design lay the same conclusion: beauty without endurance was a burden. Meanwhile, at higher headquarters, analysts turned those field notes into strategic insight. They began to see the German fuel problem not as a logistical fluke, but as a systemic flaw, a reflection of priorities that had favored brilliance over balance. One intelligence officer phrased it neatly: "They built for the sprint. We built for the march." That sentence would later be quoted in post-war studies, but for the men in April 1945, it was simply lived reality. Every road strewn with abandoned German vehicles told the same silent story. Some had been damaged, yes, but many more had simply stopped, their tanks dry, their crews gone. And as American soldiers passed them by, they couldn't help but wonder how many battles had ended not with fire, but with an empty fuel gauge. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the roads became an open museum of the Reich's mechanical legacy. Burnt-out trucks, immobilized tanks, and rows of abandoned half-tracks lined the verges like forgotten monuments. To the untrained eye, they looked like ruins of battle. To the engineers and logistics officers who passed them, they were something else, a map of exhaustion drawn in steel. Everywhere they looked, the same pattern repeated. The heavier and more sophisticated the vehicle, the more likely it was to be left behind. SD KFZ-7s were among the most common sights. Their hulking forms often rested intact, not wrecked but simply empty, their fuel gone. Crews had removed what they could: tools, radios, personal gear, and walked away. It was as if the war's most impressive machinery had been betrayed by the simplest of needs. When American mechanics examined these vehicles, they found them surprisingly clean inside, sometimes even well-maintained. Oil levels were good, belts intact, engines pristine. There was nothing wrong in the mechanical sense. What was missing was gasoline. A few quarts of fuel stood between motion and stillness. That detail fascinated American analysts because it revealed something larger than one vehicle's flaw. It exposed the limits of an entire war economy. Fuel had always been the quiet currency of the conflict, and by 1945, Germany's account was overdrawn. The synthetic fuel plants that had kept its armies running were gone, bombed to rubble by Allied raids. The Romanian oil fields that once fed the Reich were in Soviet hands. Whatever fuel remained was rationed so strictly that even elite units moved only when absolutely necessary. The SD KFZ-7, once the workhorse of artillery regiments, had become a stationary relic, not because it failed, but because the system that fed it had collapsed. In contrast, the Americans seemed to operate with endless mobility. Their vehicles ran not because they were better built, but because they were built for the system they served. Every tanker, pipeline, and truck in the Allied chain existed to keep the next one moving. Efficiency was the silent glue that held it all together. A gallon saved by one vehicle might fuel another several miles ahead. The SD KFZ-7's flaw wasn't moral or mechanical, it was conceptual. It assumed a world where fuel was permanent, where victory was fast, and where logistics would always catch up. By 1945, none of those assumptions were true. One ordnance captain, who had overseen the testing of several captured tractors, summed it up in his report: "The German vehicle is excellent in isolation. The American vehicle is excellent in a system." That single line explained more than any diagram or technical manual ever could. War was not a showcase of perfect machines. It was a contest of sustainable ones. Meanwhile, on the ground, Soldiers treated the SD KFZ-7s as curiosities. Some used them for short, heavy hauls near depots. Others converted them into makeshift tow rigs or generator platforms. The engines were powerful enough to run equipment or charge batteries when idling, and a few were repurposed to power field workshops. But most were simply left behind when the units moved again. The cost of keeping them fueled outweighed their usefulness. You could almost watch the gas disappear, one sergeant said, shaking his head as he turned off the ignition for the last time. To those who had grown used to the rugged practicality of American machines, the German vehicles felt like visitors from another philosophy, magnificent, over-designed, and somehow fragile in their perfection. It wasn't that they broke easily, it was that they demanded too much from a world that could no longer afford to give it. By early May, the SD KFZ-7s that still ran did so mostly behind the front lines. Their role had shifted from symbols of German power to lessons in American efficiency. Mechanics used them as teaching tools for younger recruits, how to read design priorities, how to understand trade-offs, how even the strongest engine could become a liability when built without restraint. Every gear, every polished fitting, every precision bolt spoke of ambition unchecked by practicality. And as American officers drove past yet another abandoned column of German machines, they didn't just see defeat, they saw a warning about what happens when brilliance forgets endurance. When the German surrender finally came in early May, the guns fell silent, but the work of understanding the war had only begun. American engineers, logisticians, and intelligence officers were tasked with cataloguing the vast amount of captured equipment scattered across Europe. Hundreds of SD KFZ-7 tractors were rounded up from fields, depots, and roadside ditches. Some were shipped back to Britain or the United States for detailed study. Others were used temporarily to help clear wreckage or move artillery during the occupation. Each one carried not just steel and gears, but clues about how a nation had fought and why it had ultimately failed to sustain that fight. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, technicians approached the captured vehicles like detectives. They stripped them down bolt by bolt, documenting every detail. The Maybach HL62 engine was tested on dynamometers, its efficiency measured at various speeds and loads. It was an impressive piece of machinery, smooth, responsive, and durable, but the data confirmed what soldiers in Europe already knew. For every unit of power it produced, it consumed far more fuel than its American counterpart. When plotted on a chart, the difference looked almost embarrassing. The German engine devoured gasoline at a rate that would have been unacceptable even for heavy civilian trucks. The engineers' notes were precise but quietly critical. They described the SD KFZ-7 as mechanically excellent but strategically inefficient. The fuel system was sophisticated yet wasteful. The transmission finely built yet geared for power at the expense of endurance. Every part seemed designed for ideal conditions, not for the messy reality of sustained war. One observer wrote, "If efficiency is discipline, then the German engine lacks discipline entirely." It wasn't an insult, it was an observation born of data. What fascinated the analysts most was how consistent the philosophy was across all German designs. The Panther tank, the Tiger, even smaller trucks like the Opel Blitz, all followed the same pattern: power prioritized over efficiency, elegance over economy. It was a mindset rooted in confidence, perhaps even arrogance, a belief that superior engineering could overcome any material shortage. But by 1945, that faith had been tested and found wanting. The Americans, by contrast, had accepted their limitations from the start. They built machines to be refueled easily, repaired quickly, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed complexity with practicality. The post-war reports didn't just critique, they educated. The lessons drawn from vehicles like the SD KFZ-7 influenced an entire generation of American design thinking. When the US Army began developing new vehicles in the late 1940s, engineers were instructed to consider operational efficiency as a core requirement. It wasn't enough for a vehicle to perform well, it had to perform well long enough and cheaply enough to keep an army moving. Every drop of fuel saved meant another truck on the road, another mission completed, another operation sustained. Some officers even credited the SD KFZ-7 indirectly for this shift in mindset. "It taught us what not to build," one colonel wrote in a 1947 memorandum. "We admired it and learned from it, but we will not repeat it." His statement captured the paradox perfectly. A machine that had once symbolized German strength had become a cautionary emblem for American planners. Back in Europe, many of the remaining German tractors were scrapped or repurposed. A few ended up in civilian service. Farmers used them to haul equipment, construction crews to move rubble in devastated cities. They were too well made to discard immediately, but their hunger for fuel made them impractical in a rebuilding world where every resource was rationed. Even in peace, they consumed more than they returned. Still, those who had driven them remembered them vividly. Veterans would later describe the feeling of sitting behind that massive steering wheel, hearing the Maybach engine rumble like distant thunder, and watching the fuel gauge fall as if time itself was draining away. The SD KFZ-7 had power few machines could match, but that power came at a price the world could no longer afford. As the post-war years unfolded, the story of the SD KFZ-7 slowly shifted from a tale of battlefield utility to one of industrial philosophy. Historians and engineers began to view it not simply as a military vehicle but as a reflection of an entire nation's mindset during the war. To them, the half-track was a perfect metaphor for the Third Reich itself: ambitious, technologically advanced, and fatally unsustainable. At first glance, the SD KFZ-7 appeared flawless. Its suspension system, with its intricate interleaved wheels, offered exceptional stability. Its towing capacity outperformed most Allied vehicles of similar size. And the craftsmanship was undeniable. Every weld, every bolt, every panel showed precision. But this perfection came at the expense of practicality. The machine had been built to impress, not to endure scarcity. Like much of the German war effort, it was optimized for rapid victories, not prolonged struggles. Meanwhile, the American M3 half-track, simpler, rougher, almost inelegant by comparison, had proven itself the better soldier. It wasn't just that it consumed less fuel, it was that it fit seamlessly into a broader ecosystem of logistics. Spare parts were interchangeable, repairs could be done by almost any mechanic, and its components were manufactured in ordinary factories across the United States. Where the German SD KFZ-7 demanded expertise, the M3 encouraged adaptability. One could survive on ingenuity, the other required perfection. In a world of chaos and uncertainty, ingenuity always won. By the 1950s, the US military had taken those wartime lessons and embedded them deeply into new vehicle designs. Reports from the Army's development branches repeatedly referenced sustainability over specialization as a guiding principle. Vehicles like the M59 and later the M113 carried the DNA of that philosophy. They were not built to dazzle, they were built to last, to move armies efficiently over long campaigns without draining the lifeblood of their supply lines. In this way, the ghost of the SD KFZ-7 lived on as a silent advisor, reminding engineers what happens when a machine demands more than its world can provide. Interestingly, not all nations drew the same conclusions. The Soviet Union, with its vast oil reserves, continued producing vehicles that consumed staggering amounts of fuel, believing that quantity and brute force could compensate for inefficiency. Their designs often mirrored German logic more than American restraint: power first, economy second. But for the United States, where every gallon during the war had traveled thousands of miles across submarine-patrolled oceans, fuel efficiency remained sacred. The idea that a machine could win battles but lose campaigns had become an unshakable truth. When historians revisited the fuel records and operational data decades later, they found that the implications were enormous. Had American vehicles burned fuel at German rates, the Allied supply chain would have required nearly twice as many ships, tankers, and trucks to sustain operations in Europe. Some analysts calculated that this inefficiency might have delayed key offensives by months, or even rendered them impossible. The logistics network that powered the liberation of Europe depended on balance, on machines that moved efficiently, predictably, and often. The SD KFZ-7, for all its brilliance, was an imbalance made of steel. Yet even with this reputation, the vehicle retained an aura of respect among those who studied it. It was not a failure of craftsmanship, it was a victim of context. In a different world, one with endless fuel and short wars, the SD KFZ-7 might have been hailed as the perfect machine. But wars are fought in the real world, where every mile cost something. And when that cost became fuel, the German workhorse simply ate itself out of relevance. Today, when visitors stand before the surviving SD KFZ-7s in museums, painted, polished, and quiet, they rarely realize the irony. The placards describe its towing capacity, its role with the 88mm gun, its powerful Maybach engine. But none mention the simple truth that defined its legacy: it could move mountains, but not for long. Its story is a reminder that power, without restraint, eventually becomes a burden. In the years that followed, the legend of the SD KFZ-7 continued to evolve, not as a symbol of failure, but as a study in brilliance limited by circumstance. Collectors, restorers, and historians came to view it with a kind of technical admiration. To rebuild one was to touch the mechanical soul of an era that believed in mastery through precision. Every lever and linkage told the same story, that someone, somewhere, had refused to compromise. And yet, that refusal was precisely what made the machine obsolete. When restorers in the 1980s and 1990s began resurrecting old examples from barns and scrapyards across Europe, they were struck by how intact the vehicles remained. The steel frames were resilient, the engines could still turn after decades, and even the complex half-track suspensions often worked once cleaned and lubricated. It was proof of extraordinary craftsmanship. But once the engines ran again, the same truth resurfaced. The fuel vanished almost as quickly as it was poured. The machine had lost none of its appetite. Museums that operated restored SD KFZ-7 soon faced the same dilemma their wartime counterparts had. Keeping one running for public demonstrations required gallons of gasoline for just a few minutes of motion. The machine's engineering was perfect, but its logic belonged to another age. So most museums learned to keep them idle, preserved, not operated, serving as static reminders of how even great design can outlive its purpose. In a broader sense, the SD KFZ-7 became a lens through which to view the contrast between two philosophies of war. Germany's approach valued performance at any cost, while America's prized sustainability and scale. Both nations produced extraordinary machines, but only one designed them to last within the limits of reality. The difference was not in genius, but in discipline. For modern engineers, military historians, and strategists, that lesson remains relevant. Technology continues to evolve towards sophistication, but history whispers a warning. Complexity must serve endurance, not replace it. The SD KFZ-7 stands as a quiet monument to that truth, a machine that performed beautifully in the short term, only to be undone by its own expectations. Even today, footage of the vehicle moving across muddy terrain can feel mesmerizing. The half-track glides smoothly, its wheels and treads working in perfect harmony. It looks unstoppable. And that, perhaps, is the greatest illusion of all. The SD KFZ-7 was unstoppable, right up until the moment it stopped itself. In the end, its story isn't one of defeat but of revelation. It reminds us that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot escape the conditions that surround it. A brilliant engine cannot outrun empty fuel tanks, just as a perfect plan cannot survive without the means to sustain it. The SD KFZ-7 teaches this with elegance and irony, its silent frame still echoing with the hum of an engine that once promised endless power. And so, when we look back at that machine, not as soldiers or mechanics, but as observers of history, we see more than gears and armor. We see a lesson written in motion and stillness alike, that true strength isn't measured by how far a machine can go, but by how long it can keep going once the road turns uncertain. That is why, decades later, the SD KFZ-7 remains more than a relic. It is a reflection, a mirror held up to the ambitions of a time when brilliance ran faster than reality could follow.